This is Guns Unpacked, a podcast where we interrogate, engage, and elevate the terms of the gun debate as we know it. I am your host, Jennifer Carlson, director of the Center for the Study of Guns and Society at Arizona State University. Today, we are joined by one of my very favorite scholars, Dr. Emine Fidan Elcioglu from the University of Toronto, where she is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology, and she just got tenure. Congratulations, Fidan. So her work focuses on immigration, political struggles, and examines issues of social domination, state power, and inequality. Her recent book, Divided by the Wall, Progressive and Conservative Immigration Politics at the U.S.-Mexico Border, was published by the University of California Press in 2020. It is based on 20 months of immersive research with activists on both sides of the political spectrum in order to illuminate why and how Americans collectively mobilize around immigration and border policy. Her current research is also about political polarization. She now studies voting behavior among foreign-born Canadians, and she's specifically looking into why more and more immigrants are veering to the political right in elections. Welcome, Fidan. We're so excited to have you.
Thank you for having me.
So let's get started with your first book. So this is a book about immigration, but immigration takes you to Arizona, which is also ground zero in many ways for guns. And I do want to get to the guns, but first I want to talk about the moment you arrive in Arizona with respect to the politics of immigration. So you arrive long before there's even a glimmer that Trump would become president in 2016, long before the Build a Wall becomes a political chant. Can you take us back to the moment that you enter the political moment when you start your research for this book?
Absolutely. This was back in 2010. Arizona Senate Bill 1070 had just been signed into law by the Republican governor of the time. So Arizona police could investigate the immigration status of anyone they suspected of being undocumented. This created an uproar, not only locally, but nationally. And there was a lot of discussion, sort of both nationally and I should say internationally, about how crazy Arizona had become. Civil rights organizations, of course, were very critical of the fact that this would basically encourage the police to racially profile against Latinos and basically anyone who was assumed to be quote unquote foreign based on, say, their speech and, what they were wearing. I mean, how can you possibly tell someone's immigration status by glancing at them, no less seeing them in a passing car, right? The lower courts in Arizona immediately blocked SB 1070. But over the next 2 years, what we see is a lot of copycat bills in 23 other states, of which 5 are successfully ratified. And then in 2012, we also see how this case gets to the Supreme Court, Arizona et al. Versus United States. The Supreme Court strikes down 3 of SB 1070's measures, but it reinstates the most controversial measure, which is that police are able to stop and detain anyone suspected of not having the proper immigration paperwork. Here we are today. SB 1070 is no longer considered such an out there kind of legislation. It's in fact been institutionalized not only by the Supreme Court, it's increasingly something that is considered a normal approach to immigration enforcement by both the Republican and the Democratic Party.
Yeah, in terms of sort of the themes that run through from 2010 up to today, this idea that, immigration is this extremely pressing issue. So I just looked up the recent Pew poll data, and it was ranked 6th among top problems facing the U.S. Half of people said that it was a very big problem. What I think is so interesting about your book is that one of the opening sort of puzzles that you lay out is like, look, people, at large in the United States are very concerned about this issue, but for many of the people, even many of the people who are most vigorously mobilized around it, they're not actually impacted directly. I was wondering if you could tell us more about sort of this puzzle. And also, your book is so well laid out because of the way that you sort of just draw us into so many puzzles and paradoxes about this issue. You go into the 2 paradoxes as you lay them out in terms of the people on the pro-immigrant and anti-immigrant side of this debate. And so could you just kind of bring us into the puzzle of what you were really working through with your book and with your fieldwork?
Yeah, when we normally think about any type of political mobilization, whether it's on the left or the right, the common sense assumption is that people get involved because they themselves could be a direct beneficiary if that movement, if that mobilization manages to be successful. But in this case, what we have is people getting involved, but who are themselves have no sort of direct connection to the issues at hand, right? So we're not talking about people who have undocumented family members, right? And who therefore want to get involved because they're worried about whether their loved one is going to get deported, right? We're talking about people who are actually quite legally and racially secure, right? A lot of the folks that I was talking to on the left were middle class white Americans with no immediate family histories of immigration. A lot of them were women, interestingly enough, but they gave their time to this issue. And on the right, a lot of white folks, Americans, they're not directly impacted by immigration. So one of the things that has been talked up by Trump is the folks who have family members who were killed by an undocumented immigrant in, say, a car accident or, some type of crime. These are not the people who are getting involved in the sort of anti-immigrant right-wing mobilization, right? They might become the symbols of it, but they're not the ones who are actually getting involved. So then the question is, if it's not clear how you're benefiting from this mobilization, then why are you getting involved? Involvement isn't just, an hour a week. It's like hours and hours every week, right? And some people are retired, but a lot of them are not retired, right? So that means they're using their time off from work, they're using their weekends, they're using up their vacation days to somehow contribute to their organization that they're involved with, right? It also means money, especially on the right. If we're talking about people who are pretty financially strapped and who are trying to put together the funds in order to buy the weaponry, but all the camping gear that they need in order to camp out in the middle of the desert for a week or 2 weeks, those things add up, right? So it's a huge financial burden too.
Yeah, yeah. And I think right there, could you just lay out because when people think about immigration politics, you're totally right. Is it responding to Pew and saying, I think this is a really important issue, or is it something way more involved? Can you just lay out what the pro-immigrant and anti-immigrant organizations, the people involved in those organizations in your research, what were they actually doing?
What these immigrant rights organizations were trying to do was teach people in the sort of urban areas about what their rights are if they encounter the police, right? In the case of the desert where people are crossing through, these are very treacherous areas where exposure to the elements could mean death. These pro-immigrant folks would go out with sort of humanitarian supplies. And if they encountered a migrant who was, crossing the desert, they would give them food and water and any type of medical assistance that they needed so that if they were in a vulnerable spot, they wouldn't have to call Border Patrol for help and then get deported. These are sort of what people are doing on the left. And then on the right, it's kind of like the opposite, right? So in the urban areas, they're working with the police to try to help them be more effective in finding immigrants in the streets and so forth. And then in the desert, they're trying to help the Border Patrol apprehend people by finding migrant trails and setting up surveillance around those areas. So that's kind of what they're doing. These are very involved forms of mobilization.
Yeah, and core to your argument, you kind of already hinted at that by mentioning the police and how the police play not just a different role on either side, but also a different role in the imagination of either side. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how these different sides understand, imagine the state. And I think this is so powerful for understanding political polarization that, there's this fundamental divide. It's not just about, it is about immigration, and that is also about the place of the state, the place of collective action. How do they relate to the state differently?
That is sort of a key part of my findings, is that the left and the right have very different conceptions of state power. On the left, there's this sense that the state is incredibly competent, it's incredibly omniscient, it's incredibly powerful, right? It has the capacity to do a tremendous amount of damage and harm and suffering to migrants, right? And on the right, it's the complete opposite, where people sort of conceive of the state as this weakling, as the lone border patrol agent in this vast desert who is trying to do his best in order to fight against this incredibly well-coordinated, well-resourced cartel, right, that is, involved in migrant smuggling. As a result, it informs how they mobilize. So on the left, if the conception is that the state is really large, omniscient, and so forth, then it's about restrict the state's reach, hide people from the state. And on the right, it's the opposite, right? It's about expanding the state's reach and ensuring that you can help, basically being an extension of law enforcement, right? Because law enforcement apparently or ostensibly cannot do this immense job on their own.
So as a reader, I love the fact that you traverse both sides of this. But as a researcher, I have to say it gives me whiplash even imagining doing this kind of research. And of course, part of that is just it's double the ethnography. It's double the work. It's an immense undertaking. But the other part of that is that it takes a great deal of work to build rapport in one space, let alone build rapport in two spaces, let alone build rapport across two spaces that are diametrically opposed. And so, there's intellectual work. There's just like the work on the ground of being in the field. There's the intellectual work of bridging this, but there's also the moral and cultural work of, really switching between these two very different worldviews that was just part of your day-to-day experience in the field and, having to toggle constantly back and forth. And so both from the sort of analytical perspective and how you drew out, your findings and your conclusions, but also just like the day-to-day, like how did you manage that? What was that experience like for you?
Let me just say that I will never do something like this ever again. This is something you do when you're young and sort of desperate to get your graduate degree and find a well-paying job. It was hard. It was pretty hard, but it was also very gratifying. It was also very surprising, right? Because I really thought that accessing these left-wing groups would be much easier than it turned out to be. And I thought that accessing the right-wing groups would be much harder than it turned out to be. So it's a very humbling process because it's all of your assumptions get turned upside down. As someone who comes from a very leftist background, it kind of made me see some of the issues that plague the political left when it tries to organize, when it tries to recruit and retain members. And as someone who comes from a leftist background, it also helped me humanize people on the right and really see that they're not just wackos, right? That they're human beings with full lives and families, and they care and they build friendships and camaraderie, and they have communities, or they try to have communities, and they're suffering in many ways that a lot of people in not only the United States, but the world over are suffering, right, under neoliberal capitalism. So, like I said, it was a very humbling experience.
That's so funny because I was actually going to ask you, did you ever feel humbled by this, by going back and forth? So you answered my next question. And I think that's also, just kind of methodological side note. I think that's why ethnography is so powerful because, it's one thing to run an analysis, to, analyze data. But ethnography is a method where you are not just gathering the data, but you're also sort of putting your own transformation in the mix as well. Like you are kind of the model for the reader who's going to eventually pick up your book to grapple with what you find and how it presumably should transform the person who reads the book or what have you. So when you were in the field and you were going back and forth between these two sides, I'm assuming they knew you were studying the other side. And how did they react to the fact that you were studying the other side? What was that like? How did you manage that in particular?
I was completely transparent. And I don't know if that's the right approach. And it was very difficult, right? Because when you're transparent with a left wing group, that you're also talking to people that they see as their political enemy, who they sort of dehumanize and so forth, it's sort of like, well, why are you wasting your time with them, right? What could you possibly learn from them? And it made them see my project as liberal approach, sort of centrist approach to an issue that seemed very sort of black and white to them, right? And then on the right, they were suspicious, if I was sort of some type of spy, right? Like, what exactly is your intention here? But I have to say that in these moments of suspicion, right, as flustering and as frustrating and as anxiety inducing as they are in the moment, those are key data points because they give you a sense of who they see as their foe. Just to give you an example, I was following around one organization. They kept worrying, and the organization was not the type that would go out in the desert and, camp out and share their surveillance with Border Patrol. This organization was an anti-immigrant organization. What they were trying to do was develop border enforcement technology that they would eventually sell to the federal government. And their worry was that I would share their trade secrets with a competitor. So that was kind of interesting, right? It gives you a sense of how they were positioning themselves and that there were multiple actors in this field, right? It wasn't just left versus right, but it's also like that they were also concerned about that they wouldn't be able to compete as effectively against other contractors who were also vying for the same contract.
Yeah, and even just the example you gave, it raises a question of like, what kind of power is even at stake? Is it political power? Is it market power? It also really says a lot about what these groups understood as their, like the core of what they brought to the table, what their power consisted in. And, the example that you just gave of like operating procedures being divulged. And so that obviously gets us to the issue of the fact that the right, the militia side of this is armed. And I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit more, just very concretely, of what that looked like in practice. There's obviously Harel Shapiro's book talks about, the role of guns, border militias. Are they using guns? Are they practicing with guns? Are guns, largely a symbol? How do guns matter in terms of what's actually going on in these groups and how guns, I guess, are being made to matter in these groups?
One way to put it is gun culture pulls people into this activism. It pulls them, it recruits them, and then it maintains their interests. It sustains their involvement. So those mechanisms, I think, tend to get buried because we're so sort of caught up in people's ideas about the world. But, there's actually this material object at the center of this mobilization that is ensuring that people get involved and then stay involved.
Let's just jump to your 2023 social problems article, although I think it's like online first in 2023, so it may be like a 2025 article because social problems is so backed up. Anyway, you have an article in Social Problems that is about exactly this. It's about pulling guns into the conversation about political mobilization on the right with regard to immigration politics. And, one of the things that I think is really fascinating about that article, and one of the points that you make, and you kind of intimated at it with what you just said, there's a sense that, and this is kind of all over, I think you can see this in sort of mainstream discussions about the crisis of democracy in the United States. You can definitely see it in the scholarly literature, this sense that people feel powerless. And there's this sense of political alienation that is experienced very differently across different communities and across, the left versus the right, but it's driving people away from democracy. And one of the things that you say is that that's actually where guns come in, that maybe guns don't change they don't change necessarily the things that people think they're going to change, but they make activism feel differently. So like this idea that it's not about just the instrumental role of the gun, but the sort of that effective place of guns in politics. And so I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how guns change how politics feels, how activism feels, what it feels like to engage in politics, that guns transform that.
One of the things that I've been thinking more about, and I haven't quite written it out or fleshed it out yet, is the fact that a lot of my respondents are dealing with a tremendous amount of marginalization and alienation and feeling like they've been left behind.
And you're talking specifically about your respondents on the right.
Yes, my respondents on the right, so the anti-immigrant activists. When you put guns into the mix, right, the sort of ecstasy of carrying a potentially fatal tool, that kind of staves off the monotony of life, right? And also the monotony of this form of activism. The other thing that I think Eric Kleinenberg talks about in this very short article that came out many years ago is this idea that guns can also be the basis of friendship and camaraderie. And this is particularly important in the context of neoliberal capitalism, where there's a corrosion of relationships to other people. There is a corrosion of collective consciousness. And this is particularly acute in the US, where these traditional spaces for camaraderie among specifically white working class men have sort of disappeared. So I'm thinking about like the unions or the mutual aid societies of the early 20th century, right? That's where white working class men forged their friendships with others outside of the home, right? Those have been decimated. And suddenly having this sort of, again, gun-centered activism, it creates this very sort of special space where these men can air their aggrievements, right? Their white male aggrievements, be validated for them, and also build this camaraderie. I mean, I think back to some of the interviews that I did in the field where I would ask this really kind of basic question, where I would say to someone, when we were out in the base camp in the middle of the desert, what do you dislike about what you're doing? And what do you like about what you're doing? What's the best part and what's the worst part of what you're doing out here? And the worst part was the monotony, because they would just be waiting around to cross paths with migrants. But the best part, they would say, is the camaraderie. And I experienced that camaraderie. In the evenings, they would sit around the fire, tell each other stories and share jokes, and really like this kind of interesting space where these relationships were forged. Neoliberal capitalism makes it so that the premium is put on individualist actions. I put myself first. I put my family first. The public good is not really a concept that has relevance in my everyday orientation. If you're living in this self-oriented, individualist, lonely, exhausting world, this kind of site, right, where you can foster these friendships, this is very precious. This is very unique. So guns are kind of instrumental in creating that special space.
And I want to think about that connection between the politics of immigration and the politics of guns on the right. I don't know if you've been following it, but after the Bruen decision in 2022 with the U.S. Supreme Court, throwing out New York State's concealed carry regime, but then also kind of creating a new standard in terms of how to evaluate the constitutionality of gun laws. There's been a lot of movement around gun law. I mean, just so much movement in the lower courts, and at least two courts, but maybe more by the time this comes out, have actually adjudicated on this question of whether undocumented immigrants have Second Amendment rights. The second case, I think, was no, that they do not. But the first case, which came out first, obviously, the court actually said yes, that they do. They do have Second Amendment rights. They do have a right to own a firearm and use it for self-protection. And, this really, and this was this past year, this rips this divide open among gun rights proponents. And you can see this, in the comments section on gun forums. Some people were like, yes, absolutely, a right is a right. Like, it says what it means. And then others were completely against the idea of it and, very much based in xenophobic sort of, who counts as a citizen, all of this kind of stuff. I'm not going to repeat that. But I'm wondering, thinking about this question of, really putting gun rights and immigration politics into conversation, I'm wondering if you can help us navigate this. So first, I'm curious how immigrant gun owners, whether documented or not, I'm just really curious, how your fieldwork can maybe help us understand this breakdown, not between the left and the right, but actually within the pro-gun community around questions of who gets to have gun rights.
It was not a topic that ever came up in my conversations with respondents on the right. Maybe I can reorient your question a little bit by saying that it does bring up this other question of, is this sort of fight for gun rights, is it always going to be a sort of Republican issue? You yourself have talked and written about the fact that during the pandemic, there was a spike in first-time gun ownership, and a lot of 69% or so of the new gun owners were people of color, right? Particularly Black and Hispanic. A lot of them also were women. So these demographic shifts are suggesting that maybe the kind of one-to-one correspondence between pro-gun rights and then Republican sort of ideology is perhaps starting to shift, to break open. But it wasn't something that necessarily came up in my own fieldwork.
Yeah, that's super helpful context. And also it kind of raises this question of there's continuity and then there's breaks. There's points at which we can look and say, wow, this terrain has really changed. And there's been a lot of talk about both 2016 and 2020 being dividing lines. It's interesting thinking about your work and your field work that starts in 2010. And I can say this, having done research field work on guns about the same time as you were doing your field work, is that it really felt like from that moment, the dividing line was 2008. So we have President Barack Obama elected. We have all of the racist backlash that unleashed. We have the onslaught of socioeconomic insecurity coming off of the Great Recession. And then you have 2016, and which, almost feels incomparable in the unleashing of profound political division, dehumanization, and then, of course, what you just discussed with regard to 2020. And so, there's been a lot of talk within, I would say, the gun community, but including like gun researchers and gun rights activists and gun owners, about these different turning points. And something that's come up a lot is this idea of gun culture 3.0. So this like emergent sort of different kind of gun culture that's much more overtly anti-government rather than, centrally focused on self-protection, which is interesting because it kind of differs from what you were saying earlier about the right really looking at the state as like this weak state that needs the help of everyday civilians to help buttress it. And, you see more conspiracism, more division, more of a no compromise approach to the Second Amendment. And so I'm just curious because you came back after Trump was elected. You came back in 2017, right, to do sort of a second wave in your research. And so, thinking about this question of continuity versus change, do you see this over the last decade and a half? Do you see this as like a slow glide? Are there dramatic breaks? Where do you fall on sort of thinking about these different turning points?
I would certainly like to go back and do a field revisit post-pandemic to kind of see where things are, if the left is more open to guns, or if, they're starting to maybe even encourage people to take firearms training. Because back when I was doing my research, it was sort of associated with the violent nature of the right. It had no appropriate place on the left. If indeed 2020 marked a significant shift in gun demographics, which is now affecting gun culture, I expect we're going to have more sort of gun rights rallies where it's not just a bunch of conservative Second Amendment supporters, but also a lot of Antifa, anti-fascist, anti-racist, anarchist kinds of folks who are also very opposed to the militarization of the police, to the expansion of law enforcement, to crimmigration, and so forth. I should also mention I was one of those listeners who was sort of shocked to learn that Kamala Harris is also a gun owner, right? So, it's just another data point that adds to the fact. And she kind of said it in such a glib way during the debate, I am also a gun owner and I support the Second Amendment. And you can't imagine really a Democratic candidate saying that during a presidential debate in such a glib manner, say like 10 years ago. So certainly things are shifting.
Yeah, that was a very interesting moment. And so we're recording this in early September because it's going to come out. It's going to come out many months later. So we're in September 2024. And so, yeah, everyone just watched this debate between Trump and Harris. Right after that, I was like, okay, I need to do some digging. And, there's a few articles in 2019 actually discussing her as a gun owner. So this isn't something, she didn't just go buy a gun before the debate so she could say that. And it's interesting because the tone of the coverage then was, how do Democrats deal with this? Because we can't have someone who's an overt gun owner on, that's not going to work for the Democratic Party at this moment. And so, yeah, it is very interesting that you have Walz and Harris now both situating themselves as gun owners. I want to actually go back to the Social Problems article that you wrote that really links up immigration policy and settler colonialism with guns. And so I'm just going to quote from this because I think this really sums it up. So you write, to make a nation on stolen land using enslaved labor, the early American state relied on gun and immigration policy to create a well-armed white settler population. And so what you do in this article, you make this really crucial move, which is basically, we need to talk about settler colonialism in conjunction with immigration policy. These things are intertwined, and it's actually the guns that link them together. And so I'm just wondering if you could give us a little bit of a sense of the history behind your claim and specifically what we miss when we don't put guns into the mix.
I'm thinking about the 19th century, right, which is a moment when the U.S. is acquiring a lot of new territory, but the state is quite fledgling. It's trying to expand control westward and southward. You have the Gadsden Purchase in 1854, which is key because that's when Arizona is acquired. A key piece of this purchase that I didn't know before was that basically Mexico sells the U.S. this land, which includes southern Arizona, but only on the condition that the U.S. prevents marauding Indians from crossing over into Mexican territory. And then 10 years later, you have these Homestead Acts, which basically legalize the theft of indigenous land in that area and so forth. These are incredibly big moves. We're not talking about empty land. We're talking about populated land that indigenous communities have been living on for thousands of years. And then you suddenly have this new sort of political authority coming in and trying to insert control over this area. Well, guns are very key to that, right? To that expansionism, because that's the only way that it's through the threat of violence that you can actually push forward your political agenda, which is to expand the U.S. It's a fledgling state that is trying to do this. So one way that they deal with this problem is by bringing settlers over and doing it in a very selective way, right? So we want white people, but we want them from Northern Europe. We don't want them from Southern Europe. We don't want them to have anarchist views. We don't want them to be part of any type of syndicate or trade union, etc. And then we want them to settle these lands that have been robbed from indigenous people, and we want them to maintain control over that land. So they need to be armed, right? So it really is kind of a key part of the nation-making process. Part of what I was trying to do in the article, and I don't know how successful I was, is that to say that sort of historical legacy continues into today. This kind of settler colonial exigency, this sort of white nation making effort is still in effect, and it manifests itself in the sort of immigration guns nexus that we're seeing play out in contemporary politics.
Yeah, and I think that's really powerful because thinking about defensive oriented gun culture, thinking about what people call gun culture 2.0, there's often this tendency to be like gun culture 1.0. It was, just about hunting. And, obviously we see this in conversations and debates about guns in the contemporary moment where, it's like there's the hunters and then there's the scary gun owners. And there's this like divide between good and bad gun culture. And, I think research and analysis like what you're bringing to the table shows us that gun culture 1.0, whatever that is, it's not just about hunters going out. And it's a much more politically charged venture that's completely intertwined with settler colonialism. And one thing that I've been actually spending a lot of time, because hunting is actually one of the areas that I am not as well versed in with regard to the politics and social life of guns. But, I think that a lot of times we think about guns in terms of the slaughter of indigenous peoples, control over land, but even the regulation of hunting itself. So like as a means of starving out people, that is also a means of genocide. So anyway, I'm just really excited that you're putting all of these different pieces into conversation. Another thing that this kind of raised for me, and I really want to get your take, especially since you're, sitting in Canada right now, people often ask this question of like Canada and Australia, they're both British colonies, they're both, settler colonial nations, they don't have the same culture as the US. And, every time I've gotten this question, I'm like, yeah, well, it's because settler colonialism plays out really differently in the US versus Canada or Australia. And so I'm curious, how would you answer that question, given how you've thought through this with the US context?
It is a puzzle to me as well, because in so many respects, actually, I know you're kind of making out the US to be very different from Canada, but in many respects, they're very similar, right? You also have country that is founded on slavery. They didn't have as many enslaved people as the US did, but it certainly was about enslaving Black people in order to sort of get the settler colonial economy going, right? It's about the theft of land from indigenous people. And then, of course, you also have immigration laws that are very, very similar. So in 1965 is the Hart-Celler Act in the US, which basically gets rid of the racist quotas that were in place and introduces a sort of a different method of selecting immigrants, right? In Canada, you have the point system, which gets introduced 2 years later in 1967. What's interesting is that both the US and Canada are among the last sort of liberal democracies in the world to reject these racist quotas when they're admitting people. So there's a lot of similarities between the US and Canada, but you don't have the same kind of gun politics in Canada as you do in the US. And what's interesting, I mean, especially now, we were just talking about the Bruin decision. In Canada, you cannot own a gun for the purpose of self-protection. Guns can only be used for sporting or hunting. And then there's also this anti-gun clause. So if you have a gun that is older than a certain year, then it's not prohibited, right? But they're very specific and very strict about how old the gun has to be. Nonetheless, despite this kind of background, right, where guns seem to be kind of irrelevant to the left-right kind of divide, what we have seen, again, since 2020, which is the year of the pandemic, what we have seen is the Liberal government making systematic efforts to ban the distribution of guns, right? So in 2020, there were 1,500 types of assault-style rifles that were banned. 2 years later, the Liberal government prohibited all variants of AR-15s. The same year, they also introduced a Bill C-21, which basically put a freeze on sales and the import of handguns. And the government also proposed a gun buyback program. What's interesting is that, the Conservative Party of Canada, especially under its new leadership of Pierre Poilievre, has made the repeal of C-21 kind of a key piece of its agenda, right? And the way they frame it is, the Liberal government is attacking hunters, or that the C-21 is an attack on hunters. it's become sort of a key piece of their platform. It's not as central as with the Republican Party in the United States, but it's certainly picking up steam and it's becoming more of a central issue for the conservatives here. And in my own research, you mentioned, that I'm doing research right now, interviewing immigrants and also their second generation children who are now, they're all Canadian citizens. And I'm asking them about their political worldviews. And especially I'm talking to people who are conservative leaning, and guns do come up as an issue, interestingly enough, especially among younger people. So I think things are also shifting in Canada as we speak. So, this kind of, Canada is very different from the US needs to be maybe qualified to some extent.
Yeah, I really appreciate you disabusing us of this notion that Canada is this sort of like liberal utopia that like if things go south in the
Yeah.
US, liberals can just move to Canada and somehow Canada is going to be like, sure, come here, that's fine. We've saved a space for you, and it's just this great thing. So I really, really appreciate that. And I'm curious, thinking about how repealing all these gun laws that have been recently passed, how that's becoming now this conservative platform issue in Canada. When people talk about conservatism, I think they can talk about it in a variety of ways. So they can think about, obviously, the policy issues that are part of a conservative platform, but they can also think about conservatism in terms of a style of politics. And I'm curious, the word conservative, like, does it even travel from the US to Canada? It sounds like it's shifting in terms of its mobility across those two spaces, maybe. You've given us some sense of like the similarities, but US audience, if we're reading, about conservative politics in Canada, where do we need to be aware that like we're seeing the same word, but it's not really meaning the same thing? Or maybe it is really converging. What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't have a clean answer for you, unfortunately. The people that I'm talking to, one thing that they might say is, yes, I plan on voting for the Conservative Party of Canada in the next federal election. But if I were in the US, I would not vote for the Republican Party. So that signals that they see a difference between especially Trumpian republicanism and the sort of variant of conservatism that exists in Canada today. And Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the CPC, has been very careful towing this line of like, on the one hand, really sort of building on some of the conservative ideology and ideas that are coming out of the US, but also qualifying them in the context of so-called multicultural Canada, right? Multiculturalism is a key piece of the Canadian nation-making process, right? It's an ideology that is very much baked into Canadian nationalism versus the US, where it's a melting pot. You're supposed to put aside your ethno-racial background or your linguistic background and assimilate, right, in this very smooth kind of way. So yes, there are these kinds of differences. Pierre Poilievre is always keeping an eye on what's happening in the US. Now, another thing I will say is that if we think about the Freedom Convoy, um, which was this really interesting kind of mobilization of truck drivers, other folks who have big vehicles converging in Ottawa in response to so-called mandates by the government to make vaccinations compulsory. That whole scene of people sort of driving these big trucks with huge Canadian flags converging in downtown Ottawa, potentially, I mean, I didn't see, in the photos that I saw, there weren't a ton of people with guns, but certainly there were some. That whole image and the symbolism was very reminiscent of, in some ways, January 6th, right, in the US. So there's definitely some convergences happening because conservatives in Canada are listening to what's happening in the US and also vice versa, right? It's about sort of seeing what has been effective elsewhere and trying to maybe import it in a way that is contextually appropriate for the local context.
So we're kind of winding down on time. I feel like we could just go on, but I'm going to be respectful of your time and not take that much more of it. Again, we are we're chatting in September. We don't know what's going to happen, if there's going to be an October surprise, what's going to happen in November. There's a lot of, open questions that we'd like answered before we go into 2025. So I'm not going to ask you to make a political prediction. But what I want to know is, as an expert in guns and immigration and in political participation, what are you going to be looking out for in 2025? Like, what do you think are the trends or the dynamics that we need to be attentive to?
Yeah, I think, something that we were talking about before is just, how we're seeing a democratization of gun ownership. And I think it will be important to see where this takes us. What does this mean for a politics that has the Second Amendment, the defense, the uncompromising defense of Second Amendment baked into it? If suddenly what we're seeing is a shift in the culture of who owns guns, right? And for whom it's appropriate to have guns, I think we might see a sort of reassembling of what it means to be a leftist versus a right-wing advocate, right? So that's certainly something that I'm curious to see how it plays out. And of course, I'm curious to see what happens with immigration. I mean, what was once considered sort of a fringe piece of legislation, which I talked about earlier in the show, Senate Bill 1070 coming out of Arizona, has now become institutionalized, not only institutionalized, but normalized. And so, it'll be interesting to see where this takes us, because it's an unsustainable form of politics, right? You keep building up the border, you keep building up the border, you keep burdening cops with immigration enforcement tasks, etc. At some point, this is going to, and it has in many ways, it's going to lead to some form of crisis, right? I mean, all these resources, all these very precious resources are being sucked up into this kind of criminalization that has no end.
Everybody listening to this podcast should read your book, Fidan, Divided by the Wall. If you can close us out with some reading recommendations, what are you reading now?
It's a book that I read like last month, but I will put it out there. I read Unsettled Borders, The Militarized Science of Surveillance on Sacred Indigenous Lands by Felicity Amaya Schaefer. Really loved this book because she is a professor at UC Santa Cruz, and she really tries to figure out how can we make migration scholarship, scholarship about the border, how can we put settler colonialism into focus, right? It's a very important corrective to the sort of migration and border scholarship by sort of centrally focusing on ongoing settler colonialism at the border, at the U.S.-Mexico border, but with Arizona as a case study. And I'm currently, I don't know, I mean, it's not really relevant to anything, but I am reading a book in Turkish called Mutsuzluk, which is translates as Disquiet by Zülfü Livaneli. And it's set in Mardin, which is a Turkish city near the Syrian border, where there's a lot of ethnic and linguistic mixtures, Turkish, Kurdish, Arabic. And it's about a journalist from Istanbul who's trying to figure out why his childhood friend was killed. It's basically a rumination on sort of what it means to be born into this geopolitical quandary, because one of the central characters is a Yazidi woman who is fleeing ISIS. And it's really an sort of what I would say an anguishing reflection on the hubris of humanity, because at one point he says something like this: our species has no right to live in this world, destroying the world and each other. Seeing ourselves as superior to plants and animals is an illusion. And I feel like, unfortunately, that quote really is important in the context of all these crises that we've been talking about, and especially in this existential crisis that we're facing, which is climate change.
Yeah, that's an incredibly profound and heavy note to end on, but is actually Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I feel like that's in some ways, like that's where this all leads us, is into that very, very heavy place. And so thank you for bringing us there. Thank you for spending all of this time unpacking your research and thinking about guns. And thank you for thinking more and more centrally about guns. I have just so very much learned from your work, and also, enjoyed this conversation. So everybody listening, buy Divided by the Wall, read it. Dr. Emine Fidan Elcioglu from the University of Toronto, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful.
Thank you for listening. This has been Guns Unpacked, and I've been your host, Jennifer Carlson, the director of the Center for the Study of Guns in Society at Arizona State University. You can learn more about our center and all we do at csgs.asu.edu. Music in this episode is by Blue Dot Sessions. This episode was produced by Regina Ravazova.